Yeah, thank you for your invitation and your kind introduction.
Very professional introduction.
My paper will begin with parallelism versus counterpoint concerning sound design in the early talkies. It will then elaborate on the musical quality of sounds and conclude with the influence of radio on sound design of the early talkies in Germany. If you have a close look at the text written by German music and film critics in the late 20s and early 30s, you get the impression that sound and silent film were considered to be two discrete art forms. Therefore, contemporary composers such as Kurt Weill and film theorists such as Fela Barlowstedt, his film from 1930, Rudolf Arnheim Film als Kunst 1932, or Siegfried Kakor, demanded a distinct aesthetic approach for both film forms. Concerning sound film, they postulated that a parallelism between picture and sound had to be avoided because of the redundant doubling of reality. In 1928, Laszlo Moormann emphasized that the visual statement could be weakened by a parallel acoustic event. This opinion was confirmed by Walter Bruckner in 1929. For him, a consequence of sound film had to be counterpoint, a deliberately provoked confrontation of picture and sound for the purpose of intensity. Such prejudices about a naturalistic use of sound and film might have been based on the statement of sound issued by the directors Eisenstein, Pudovkin, and Alexandrov in 1928. This manifesto was first published in the German press as the authorized German version, specifically in the Lichtbildbühne and Vossische Zeitung. One can imagine how relevant this topic was for German film critics at that time. I quote Eisenstein: "Only a contrapunctual use of sound in relation to the visual montage piece will afford a new potentiality of montage development and perfection. The first experimental work with sound must be directed along the line of its distinct non-synchronization with the visual images." Although director Gyga Vertov criticized the required synchronization between image and sound in several articles and argued that image and sound can have any form of relationship, the sound design in his early sound film enthusiasm from 1930 is mainly based on the principles of counterpoint and asynchrony. This film is only one example of the far-reaching influence of that manifesto. I will show you a clip with three different sequences from this film.
1930 году.
Film theorist Rudolf Arnhem responded to the manifesto too and discussed the demands of the writing in his article Todfilm mit Gewalt in 1931. He agreed with Eisenstein's position that one doesn't need to hear what is one already able to see, but he criticized the concept of counterpoint. As he pointed out in his article Geräusche in der linken Hand in 1933, an added aesthetic value of the auditive level can only be realized by creating a contrast to the visual level. Arnhem calls it the rhythmized monotony of noises in contrast to the manifoldness of the picture. He argues that the rhythmic repetition of sounds and voices is the simplest and most effective method to bring them both into musical form and therefore in the best artistic form in general. But not only film critics were influenced by the manifesto and the idea of counterpoint. UFA's production manager at that time, Erich Pommer, also agreed to the demands of contemporary film critics. In his early sound film production, he preferred sparingly used dialogue and claimed that noises should be used selectively and only because of their dramatic potential. Perhaps the effects of Pommer's aesthetic position can be pointed out in films such as Robert Siodmark's Voruntersuchung from 1931. As Wolfgang Jacobsen noted, the noises in this film were especially rhythmized and dramatized. For instance, a pencil is pulled along the ribs of a radiator. In this context, the question arises of to what extent the German film industry tried to distance itself with an artificial sound design from a more and more dominant Hollywood aesthetic. It seems to be obvious that the German film industry tried to support their own productions and wanted to play for time to close the technological gap between itself and the American film. Such considerations were stated by Paul Dessau in an article in 1929. Dessau considered it necessary to curb the presentation of American films in order to promote national film production. To quote Eisenstein, it's his quote, the salvation of sound film comes, if at all, from Germany. At the so-called Congress of Independent Film that took place at Lazarat's Castle in Switzerland in September 1929, delegates from 15 countries, among them Sergei Eisenstein, Alberto Cavalcanti, Bela Barna, Franz Richter, and Walter Rothman, as chairman, tried to create a global organization against the international kitsch. This demand seemed to be fraught with problems. The German nationals and the National Socialists, both of whom were obtaining more and more influence in Germany at that time, tried to gain an advantage from the positions of the intellectual left-wingers. For example, Joseph Steinberg's An American Tragedy from 1931 wasn't shown in German cinemas on the flimsy grounds that the movie used sound in a naturalistic way. And Alfred Hugenberg, chairman of the DNYP and owner of the UFA, refused to show certain films in the cinemas, such as Louis Milestone's Our Quiet on Western Front from 1930, as well as all productions from Russia. These examples illustrate the conflictual situation of aesthetic and political opinions about sound film circa 1930. In 1932, frustrated by the development of the German film industry, Arnheim, in his article Sound Film Gone Astray, also Tonfilm auf Abwägen, called film a sounding whore, eine tönende Hure. The musical quality of sound. The conjunction of music and other sounds in early sound film is based on the convergence of both acoustic dimensions that was noticeable in the 19th century. In multimedia performances, such as a diorama, sounds began to emancipate themselves from music as a distinct acoustic experience. At the beginning of the 20th century, the use of noise as a compositional element became central for futurism and fluidism. Artists such as Francesco Patella seized Ferruccio Busoni's ideas of micro-intervallia and the musical quality of sounds that he explained in Entwurf einer neuen Ästhetik der Tonkunst in 1907. Patella demanded new sound progressions that should be based on series of noises. The futurists' ideas had great influence on film artists at that time. For example, in 1929, Luigi Russolo accompanied with his extraordinary instruments a few scientific films by the French director Jean-Henri Levi. Besides the Russian film avant-gardes, namely Eisenstein, Vertov and Dovzhenko, who referred repeatedly to the ideas of futurism, German composers such as Edmund Meisel concentrated on the musical quality of noises regarding sound film. In his article Der Tonfilm hat eigene Gesetze, Sound Film has its own rules, published in 1928, he comes to the conclusion that the elements of the film score are not notes, but pictures, texts, sounds, and both spoken and sung words. Meisel argued that their selection and contrapuntal montage form the action on screen. Film critic Frank Warschauer also seemed to tie onto the ideas of futurism when he points out that the widespread area of sound material should include all acoustic phenomena. Thus, the division of the intervals finds its natural application far beyond the quarter tone. In his opinion, the radioelectric sound generation with instruments such as theremin would play an important part in the future. How relevant the ideas of the sound-like quality of music were for contemporary film critics is shown in an ironic gloss by Arnhem in his article Stumme Schönheit und tönender Unfug, New Beauty and Sounding Nonsense in 1929. Arnhem blames the woman for using the quarter-tone system from Haber in the cinema hall, a gag that was obviously easy to understand at that time. Bela Barnash discusses in more detail the aesthetic challenges that appeared with the introduction of sound film. In his book Der Geist des Films from 1930, he pointed out the musical dimension of noises several times. He speaks about the monotonous melody of the autumn rain pattering against the dark window panes. And further on, he writes that sound film will teach us to read the score of the polyphonic orchestra of life. Barnash calls attention to the rhythmic pithiness of noises that provides a fluent sound bridge to the music of the orchestra. He also elaborates on the various options in combining different noises and repeating them in dynamic periods. A symphony of sounds is thus created. In this context, Barnash mentions that it was common convention during the last period of silent film to have the orchestra imitate the sounds of nature and machines, especially in adapting the original rhythm of these sounds. Barnash came to the conclusion that even noises are given a musical shape. In his book Film als Kunst, published in 1932, Rudolf Arnhem sees substantial progress concerning the relationship between music and noise in sound film and anticipates an acoustic accompaniment that doesn't let one know whether the sounds are real or imitated by instruments. At this point, the question arises of what influence these writings had on early sound films. The experimental presentations of sound films during the days of chamber music in Baden-Baden from 1927 to 1929 provided the opportunity for discussing the theoretical positions on various films. Well-known artists from film, music and radio, such as Paul Hindemith, Paul Dessau, Hans Eisler, Walter Gronostai, Darius Milhaud, Hans Richter and Wolfgang Zeller presented their works during this festival. But not only the film and music avant-garde focused on the relationship of music and sound in their projects. In his article Granowski probiert, Granowski tries, in 1931, Rudolf Arnhem also elaborates on the sound design of Alexis Granowski's film Vom Leben, with music by Franz Waxman and sound design by Hans Bittmann and Ernst Schulz. Arnhem mentions the attempts to create melodies of sound. Machine noises of various pitches were put together similar to the tones of melody. This idea to create a melody through sounds had already been realized by Jigar Bartov in 1930 in his film Enthusiasm, where he presents the noise of a whistle with different pitches generated by modulating the speed of the film. A perfect example of the organization of composition of sounds on a distinct musical level is Arnold Frank's mountain film Stürme über den Mont Blanc, with music by Edmund Meisel. The Morse code message sounds like music, and the noise-like sound of instruments, such as the trautonium, imitates the engine noise of the aeroplane. The complex sound composition at the end of the film is also very impressive. Contemporary film critics emphasized the way sounds were treated as music. Another good example of the composition of sounds is Walter Brückmann's Melodie der Welt, created in 1929. I will show you a clip from this film. The influence of radio on sound form. Various radio plays may have had an influence on the sound design of the early talkies. Kurt Weill was one of the composers who examined the musical dimension of sounds in order to integrate them into his absolute radio art. Weill imagined that the tone and the rhythm of music can be joined by new sounds, sounds from other spheres, such as human cries, sounds of animals and nature, the rush of wind, water and trees, and a plethora of new and previously unheard sounds that can be artificially produced by a microphone if pitches are heightened or lowered, interwoven or arranged in layers. In the same year, Weill again elaborated on the musicalization of sounds when talking about his genre folk drama. He writes about Gounod's radio play Bellinzona, in which the impression of a rolling train is suggested by 6 different acoustic drones adapting the sounds of an express train. They follow each other or intersect like musical motifs. Weill called it the melody of wheels, the symphony of rhythm accompanied by chords and acoustic gestures that find their climax in violent and dissonant collision. Frank Warschauer also drew attention to the interdependence of radio play and sound film in his article Filmmusik in 1929. He noted that Walter Goer, a young student of Schönberg at that time, had been working in the field of engineered music for radio plays. The first radio plays were recorded on wax records, a little later on non-wax records and sample material. Hans Flesch, director of Berlin's radio station, especially took a stand for recording radio plays. In this context, one has to mention the experience of Friedrich Walter Bischoff and the acoustic films of Alfred Braun. The interactions between radio and film that go beyond the material level at the time are quite revealing. For example, Ernst Johansson's radio play Brigadevermittlung from 1929, which was successfully broadcast in 11 countries, served as a model for Georg Wilhelm Pabst's Westfront 1918 from 1930. The focus of the soundtrack is particularly evident in the work of director and media artist Walter Ruttmann. In his short play Weekend from 1930, which was recorded on sound film material, he processed noises, bits of music, and particles of dialogue into a complex collage by using musical principles. I will present you the beginning of Weekend. Weekend is a pioneering piece of experimental radio art and seems to anticipate the music concrete of the 1950s and the new radio play of the 60s. Actually, Ruttmann tried to transpose this film musical radio play into a score. Even contemporary critics praised the play as a symphony of noise and mentioned the dual quality of the sounds that come from reality but are processed musically at the same time. Furthermore, Ruttmann worked as a sound engineer for Abelgran's film La Fin du Monde from 1930 that is related to his works Melody, Der Welt and Weekend. In 1933, Ruttmann directed the Italian film Acciaio, bridges from one scene to another were built by analogies of sound and music. Again and again, Ruttmann exceeded the traditional boundaries of film, drama, music and sound art. Indirectly, he corresponds with Arnhem, who subsumed the various new arts under the term reproductive art in his article Film und Radio in 1933. These examples lead us to the conclusion that many connections exist between radio plays and talkies on both an aesthetic and personal level, which we should continue to pursue. Thank you.